Okay. Good morning, everyone. Um, I am Emma. I'm the programs manager at the Greater Nashua Chamber of Commerce. I thank you guys for joining us. I also apologize. I have my window closed, but of course, right now when we started this Zoom is when trash pickup is happening. So I apologize for that. But so is life, right? I just want to start real quick before we jump into it by thanking our sponsor, New Hampshire Career Academy today. New Hampshire Career Academy is redefining how education meets the moment for New Hampshire students. They are a public charter school that is free for New Hampshire residents to attend, and through close collaboration with the community college system of New Hampshire and local partnerships with employers, they're able to help students get high school degree requirements while also getting either an associate's degree or industry credentials in fields such as healthcare, technology, and advanced manufacturing and business. And all of it is at no cost to the New Hampshire students. So again, that's New Hampshire Career Academy. We thank them for being our sponsor. And we're going to just jump right into it this morning. We have Nick Taylor from Housing Action New Hampshire and Sarah Wrightsman from New Hampshire Housing. If you two just want to each introduce yourselves, give a little overview of your organization and what you guys do before we jump into questions, that'd be great.
Yeah, good morning, and thanks for having us. So, as Emma said, I'm Nick Taylor. I'm the director of Housing Action New Hampshire. Housing Action New Hampshire is a pro-homes advocacy organization that works across the state, doing mostly state and federal housing policy. So we lobby up at the State House on a whole bunch of different public policy proposals. We work throughout the housing continuum, and so everything from unsheltered homelessness to what kind of red tape can we cut and more attainable sort of market rate reforms like accessory dwelling units, duplexes, more multifamily. And we have a broad sort of coalition of folks who we work with, a lot of direct service providers, developers, businesses, but really at the end of the day, we're just trying to get folks in New Hampshire a place to live that they can afford and trying to advance any policy that helps accomplish that mission. And we rely very heavily on New Hampshire Housing's great research and data to make our case. So love presenting with Sarah at all the events.
That's a great segue. Nick and I have presented together several times in the past week, so we're getting to be a well-oiled machine. My name is Sarah Wrightsman. I'm the manager of community engagement and education at New Hampshire Housing. We are your state's housing finance agency, and so we do all of the things that you expect your state's finance agency to do. We administer the low-income housing tax credit program and rental assistance programs like the Housing Choice Voucher program, and we have some mortgage programs for home buyers, particularly first-time home buyers and like low to moderate income home buyers. So I personally work as part of our engagement policy and communications team. So we're the team that puts together all the great research and publications that you see coming out, whether it's data or more like guides and handbooks to help you navigate housing solutions and the crisis. We also do some statewide lobbying, legislative lobbying, and so we work closely with Nick on that. My team also does community engagement work, and I specifically work on the local level with municipalities and community groups, not dissimilar to this right now, talking with people about how they can get involved in solving the housing crisis at a local level. So I will leave it there.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. I remember when we did our prep call for this, you both were like, we just came from a meeting together elsewhere. So, so thrilled that both of you could join us this morning. I do want to let all of the attendees know that please feel free to use the Q&A feature. If at any point throughout the panel you have questions that come up, throw them in that Q&A and we will be sure to answer them all at the end. But let's just start off. A question that everyone is thinking of and chattering about these days is, to what extent is the housing crisis affecting workforce attraction and retention in New Hampshire?
Yeah, I can start. I think it's pretty well documented at this point that like the housing crisis is one of the big factors that's affecting our workforce attraction and retention. And it's sort of housing and childcare keep coming up as like the two things that are impacting people who are in the workforce. So I think what's really compelling, we obviously talk a lot about like who's in the workforce and who can afford to live here, and we New Hampshire Housing just released a report called Who Can Afford Housing in New Hampshire, or Who Can Afford to Live in New Hampshire, something like that. It's on our website. And it really does talk about like, here's what people are making in like these high demand professions. And so you have a lot of like retail and food service and, you know, nurses, electricians, tradespeople. But I think what's really compelling is when folks like Dartmouth Health says like, hey, we're having a hard time hiring doctors because while they're making a good salary, they either can't afford something around here or, you know, they look at our housing market and are like, we're just really not interested in these like 3 houses that are available. So it is that combination of like what's affordable to people who are like the backbone of our workforce, and we have so little supply and so little choice that it makes it challenging to recruit people to the state, even who are making decent incomes. And Nick, if you want to add anything to that.
I mean, I totally agree. I mean, it's so acute at sort of the deepest and sort of lowest income levels, but it absolutely is touching like the entire economy. And I'm sure folks on this call have either dealt with it personally or, you know, seeing their family members try to find a place to live near where they work, or, you know, if their family is growing, how do they find a place that, you know, fits their needs? And, you know, that's why, you know, so many of the different reforms that we're talking about work across the entire income spectrum, because at every level, we need more housing. We need more multifamily. We need more starter homes. We need more accessory dwelling units. We need more places where folks can retire and stay in their community. And so it's just a huge, huge issue. And you know, when we look at some of like the public polling on this too, it shows up across income levels. It shows up across geographic regions, all sorts of demographics. Everyone is saying that they want more affordable housing options. And then you also survey businesses, and I'm sure the chamber has seen this too, but you know, when BIA did their sort of statewide survey of business leaders, so you're exactly right. Childcare and housing came up, and it was, you know, coming up in these ways. Like this is preventing us from expanding. If we're, you know, a restaurant and we want to go back to serving lunch or open 7 days a week or even 6 days a week, the issue is that we don't have the workforce to do it, and that is directly a housing problem. And it's already starting to show up, but it will only get worse. And you'll start to see businesses decide that they may be better off setting up their headquarters in, you know, Tennessee or North Carolina or somewhere where housing costs are cheaper.
Like demographics also play a role in this, right? Because we know now that like 33% of our workforce is 55 plus. You have a lot of people who are like approaching retirement or arguably are already sort of at that retirement age and want to retire, but we're having a hard time filling those roles. And like 30 years ago, the percent of our workforce that was 55 plus was only like 11%. So like we have a majorly aging workforce. So we need those like younger people here. We know birth rates are low. School enrollment is declining. So I think of us as like we're competing nationally for like young people who want to live and work here. And so making sure that they can do that and afford to do that is really important.
Great points. Thank you. This sort of segues into our next question, which is Nick, you sort of briefly mentioned accessory dwelling units earlier, and Sarah, you mentioned the limited options here. So, how do zoning regulations and local resistance contribute to these housing shortages that we're facing?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I mean, it's one that we get all the
Every
time
day.
on it. Yeah, exactly. And you know, it's interesting because housing costs are obviously complicated. Like there are a lot of factors that go into how much it costs to build a home. There's the labor costs, there's the land costs, there's the lending costs. What are some of the interest rates? There's, you know, the cost of materials, and then there's laws. And laws are where the zoning regulatory pieces show up. And so it's a piece of the puzzle. But part of the reason why I get so much focus in state and local conversations is it's the piece of the puzzle that we have the most control over, because we can change those, right? Like that is we have very limited sort of ability to impact, you know, what the Fed is doing on interest rates to set global supply chains. But what we can do is allow for different housing options. And so, you know, the big thing that we talk about is like, you know, there's nothing wrong with someone who wants to live on a single family home on a large lot. The problem is that shouldn't be your only option. And some people can't afford that, right? And so, you know, right now in far too much of our state, that is the only option. we have, it's like 13% of the state, according to the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas, you can build a single family home on less than an acre of land. And so if the acre of land costs $300,000, like right off the bat, the home is not going to be affordable or attainable for folks who are just getting started. And so like we have to look at some of those pieces to be able to say, how do we make things more affordable? How do we give people what they're asking for, which is different options so that they could choose to live in a duplex or buy a duplex and rent the other half out. Or if you're a senior or an aging member of our workforce, maybe you can't maintain that long driveway, but you'd love to live in an ADU so that you can stay near your friends or family or near your job if you're still working part-time or something. And so we take all those pieces together, and we know we gotta make some progress. And like the people in New Hampshire are really clear about this. I mean, this shows up like poll after poll where folks are saying this is the most important issue. 78% of people want more affordable housing in their community. Like 62% want it in their neighborhood. The individual policies are incredibly popular. And so that like local resistance piece is absolutely real. And I'm sure Sarah could talk about some of the great community engagement pieces that New Hampshire Housing has helped funded in the local planning process. But at the end of the day, it's still important for folks to remember that the loudest voice in the room is not necessarily the majority. And so you have to be able to deliver for the folks that maybe can't attend a meeting or are working two jobs, and so they don't have time to spend 2 or 3 hours at a planning board meeting or in Concord testifying on legislation.
Yeah, I'll emphasize that last point, which is that the people who show up at the planning board meetings or the public hearings are not representative of the entire community in the vast majority of cases. And so there are people who you are not hearing from in your community if that's the only way that you're hearing and getting feedback from your community. And it comes down to like choice and flexibility, right? So like I wouldn't personally live in a 400 square foot home because my husband records music in our house and we have a rabbit and a toddler, and like that wouldn't work for me. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't build them. And so I hear a lot of people say that, like, who wants to live in that, or I wouldn't want to live in that. But that doesn't mean that we don't offer that choice and flexibility for other people who do want it. So ideally, we have this great sort of local community engagement that happens where you get feedback from everybody in the community about how they want their community to grow, because it does have to grow, or adapt to these changes that we're talking about. And you get everybody's feedback involved, and then you zone for a way that like I always encourage people to like dream big about what you want your community and your neighborhood to look like, and then let's create your zoning based on that vision, that shared collective vision.
Thank you guys. And now sort of similar ish in nature, we're talking about different types of housing, different styles of different options for people, and for folks in the area. Have you seen any specific types of housing really succeed and really, take off in re areas in New Hampshire, or in, your research and your studies elsewhere that we could sort of mimic here? Like, have ADUs become extremely popular? Is it more apartment complexes, multifamilies? Have you guys seen any sort of trends in which way communities tend to be leading, or New Hampshire could lead?
Yeah, I'll say off the bat that like multifamily housing is like the most cost effective and efficient way to build housing. So when it comes to affordable housing, that's just likely what you're going to see. It's just more efficient than building other types of housing. I will say that I've noticed at the local level, communities embracing things like pocket neighborhoods or like cluster housing. It has that sort of like in a conservation subdivision or an open space ordinance, it has that like conservation component, which people love. And it gives you the benefits of single family housing, but without that like large lot, lots of like maintenance. And things like condos haven't been as popular to build because of some things like condo defect liability insurance. But I would say that ADUs are a really great solution, but they're super expensive for the homeowner to build, and that can be a barrier that detracts. So like you might say like, oh, ADUs are allowed by right, attached or detached. We've been really flexible at the local level, but communities like Pam in Berlin was just telling me that they allow ADUs both attached and detached by right, and none have been built. In Keene, they've allowed detached and attached ADUs by right since 2017, and they've only seen four. They're really expensive to build, and there are some barriers for homeowners still. And we're creating a guide right now for homeowners who are interested in building an accessory dwelling unit, but there are still going to be some barriers that exist. And so it's not the solution, but it is part of the solution.
Yeah. And it's such an interesting conversation because sort of what may work in like a downtown Nashua is very different than what may work in, you know, New Ipswich or some other sort of smaller community or somewhere up north, right? And so, and some of that is sort of what the demand is, and some of that is the infrastructure pieces. And so, there are some, real infrastructure challenges in New Hampshire when it comes to where certain types of housing can be built. And another sort of New Hampshire zoning atlas plug. Sarah and I were actually just on a webinar yesterday, where the New Hampshire zoning atlas, which is a project that helps visualize zoning in New Hampshire, that is run by the Initiative for Housing Policy and Practice at St. Ansem College, just added the public water and sewer data layer on top of that. And it showed that only 5.6% of all buildable land in New Hampshire has water and sewer infrastructure. About 12, 13% has water or sewer. And so that means that, like, when you're seeing the real larger multifamily buildings, that's often almost always going to be on water and sewer infrastructure. And so there's some real conversations that I think need to happen about, one, how are we most efficiently using where there is infrastructure? What does it look like to potentially expand infrastructure? And then what are the solutions for the 94% of the state that doesn't have water and sewer? Because that is most of, like, overwhelming majority of the state. And we can't only be building housing on those, that 6%. And so you start to think about things like making sure that we're using sort of science-based standards for water and septic, thinking about, what are some other sort of innovative technologies that allow for a little bit more density, with some septic systems that can sort of safely handle some more capacity. And then, like Sarah's saying, thinking about how do we reduce some of the other barriers that come into play when thinking about ADUs or some of these other things that do work better in sort of can work better in more rural communities. I think one of the things that we had heard when New Hampshire passed the statewide ADU law last year, or expanded on our existing statewide ADU law to allow for detached ADUs, is that by creating a broader statewide standard, we're hopefully opening up the market to more predictability, in that you may see more contractors, more, other modular building companies that can do ADUs and can try to bring some of those costs down, come to New Hampshire, because it's not such a maze to figure out how to get something built. There's like a clear process. They can work people through it, and the risk is minimized. And so, we're hopeful that we'll see sort of more broader adoption of accessory dwelling units. And then I think Sarah's point about conservation is a really good one too. I mean, that comes up in so many conversations, especially in some of our more rural communities. And I mean, the point is, it's clear is that, like, if we're gonna, New Hampshire is growing. And so it's a question of, like, what do you want the future to look like? And the current path for many communities is sprawl, is just sprawling out into those open spaces with large lots. And that doesn't have to be the case. In fact, you're never going to get affordability if that's the case. And so, affordable and attainable housing options and conservation goals share that common enemy of sprawl. And if we're thoughtful about, like, where we can be, a little bit smaller with our lot sizes, or where you can do some of the conservation subdivision pieces, I think there are some real solutions out there for rural communities. And then certainly thinking about, like, height and density where you have the infrastructure in places like downtown Nashua, downtown Manchester, Rochester, et cetera.
Awesome. And that sort of, you guys are so great at this. All of your answers segue into our next questions. It's amazing. It's like you do this for a living. So have you guys seen any partnerships between more rural and urban parts of the state collaborating together on ways to sort of help this housing issue, to, attain workforce through the housing, or build more housing for these, larger cities where there's the higher need for workforce, and for individuals in those jobs, but living elsewhere? Have you seen any sort of partnership, collaboration, or is there something we can hope to move towards or that we can partner with?
Unfortunately, maybe Nick has a more optimistic view. My gut answer was no. We are so local focused in New Hampshire that I don't see a lot of like regional or like cross collaboration happening. I will say that New Hampshire Housing received just about $8 million from Governor Sununu's Invest NH program, $100 million initiative. And we used that money for technical assistance, and we gave the money to communities to hire consultants to do things like updating the housing chapter of their master plan, doing a local housing needs assessment, doing a regulatory audit to look for the barriers in their ordinances, and then doing some like regulatory or zoning reform. Um, and I think the expectation when we launched the program in 2022 is that the bulk of the dollars were going to go to our cities, like the housing champions that have already been identified and are doing great work, the Manchester, the Concord, the Nashua, the Portsmouth, the Rochester. And like some of those communities did take advantage of this grant program, and that's great. But the bulk of the dollars and like the majority of the grants actually went to our like smaller, more rural and North Country communities. So that's been probably the most rewarding and surprising thing for me, is that so many of these like small rural communities are not saying this is a Manchester problem, we're not going to do anything to fix it, but are saying like we understand that we play a part, even though, you know, the sandwiches of New Hampshire are not going to solve the entire housing crisis on their own, but they recognize that they have a role to play and are sort of like jumping in there and doing what they can, even if it's incremental, it's a little bite of the apple.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I think some of the question around like how do rural and urban communities work together, it, what we've seen a little bit more of is sort of communities that are both rural working together to share some best practices. And so and that's a little bit what Sarah was talking about with some of the facilitated or some of the planning dollars. We see this with the regional planning commissions too, and some of the regional housing coalitions, which are a little bit scattered throughout the state, but trying to figure out how do you share some of the best practices, because while every community is different, what is working in one rural community without infrastructure has a decent chance of working in another rural community that doesn't have infrastructure. And so it becomes a little bit hard to sort of partner on policies, but it is possible to sort of share best practices. And I think to Sarah's point, which is really interesting, is so many folks who are making these policies, especially at the local level, are volunteers. And some have professional staff support, others do not, or have very limited, someone that does 4 different jobs for the town and doesn't have a ton of time to sort of proactively, think about future projects. They're really just dealing with like what's right in front of them. And so sort of that sharing best practices, I think is really helpful in providing forums and opportunities for those folks to share it. I mean, they're volunteering because they care about the issue. And so, they are willing to take a little bit of time to learn if, the opportunity is right. We have seen there is some conversation on where municipalities could hook up water and sewer infrastructure across municipal lines. Now, as we said, that there's not a ton of it out there, but that is an interesting discussion, and there's a potential piece of legislation that would maybe create some incentives for communities that do that kind of upgrade or expansion to have some sort of partnership in some areas of town. But like the other interesting element of all this is sort of how we fund our cities and towns. And because it's so property tax driven, like every municipality has their own property tax base, right? And so they each need to have revenue generating properties, or else the property taxes are going to go so high that it becomes really difficult for folks to live there. And so what we've seen, and this was some work that New Hampshire Housing had funded a few years ago, is that like your town centers and your sort of urban cores, but even urban in the sense of like your main street that has some mixed use, or maybe your general store if you're in like a smaller community, right? Like that's where most of the revenue is generated. Like the sprawling out is where you lose money, really, because you're having the roads are expensive to maintain, it's expensive to get services out there, it's expensive to bring utilities out there, like all of the pieces. Sprawl is really expensive. And so each community needs to think about how do they have a balanced tax base. And what you do for that is like have some areas of denser development that, bring dollars in. And there's often kind of this idea that, okay, well, like your big box stores, like your Walmarts or whoever are your, like that's where you make your property tax money. And like that's not really true, because when you actually look at what sort of the highest value per acre is, like mixed use time and time again. So mixed use where there's sort of retail or office space and residential space in the same building, that is where towns generate their revenue from. And that is what helps, offset all the sort of more expensive single family homes in your rural parts of town. So every community's got to take a look at that. And that creates a little bit of this sort of challenge on like, how could you, work, partner with other communities, because you need your own tax base too.
It more so becomes a
That's
game of sharing resources versus how can we work together?
Yes. That's one of my like major wish list items, is that every community would have a better, more thorough understanding of the relationship between land use, revenue, and expenses, because the conversation so far has been a little, people are confused about property taxes, and we can fix that. That's just an education campaign away.
And now, in terms of sort of, talking about partnerships between communities, let's talk about partnerships between organizations and communities. Have you guys seen either here in New Hampshire, or even just in, talking with other people, other states that have companies that are building workforce housing, and have there been any sort of promising developments on that front that maybe we could start thinking of here for New Hampshire, or that have happened here?
It's a good question. So, yes, we are seeing employers get into the game and either do like master leases and help finance projects, or get involved in that way, buying tax credits, or yes, building their own housing. And I have mixed feelings about this, because at the end of the day, it's not the responsibility of, say, the guy who makes tacos and has a taco restaurant to also build housing, right? And like be his employee's landlord and do all of that. That is a totally different skill set than taco making. I'm just using tacos as an example. And so I have mixed feelings about being like, yes, that is the solution, right? Is like employees need to take on a second job as a developer and landlord. But there are employers who are doing it and it's working for them. Probably everybody is familiar with, because it has been so very saturated, included by us in the press, which is Harmony Homes, the assisted living facility. They have two locations in Durham. They built some housing and childcare in a very small, adorable apartment building on their Durham, one of their Durham properties, Harmony Homes by the Bay. That's Harmony Place. And then they built that 44 unit cottage cluster development in Dover that they also have several of their employees in. And like, it's amazing. It's a wonderful example. They are great people. They're lucky that they had sort of the know-how to like do a lot of the labor themselves. I remember John Randolph, who's the owner of Harmony Homes, telling me that like he went out and bought his own backhoe, because he's like, I'm going to need it, and it makes more sense for me to buy my own and operate it than to rent one. And his wife and business partner is an architect, so like they were able to do a lot of the labor themselves. I don't know that they're like making a killing off of this, right? But it was an incredibly important investment in their business. So it is happening. It is a thing that we're seeing. Again, mixed feelings about it, but certainly employers are getting in there because they feel like they need to. And I do want to point out, just knowing my audience, that like you all are in the Nashua area. So, which means you're part of Regen Valley, and like that Manchester to Nashua area is likely to see like 9,000 new jobs, I think was the estimate, because of this like Regen Valley Tech Hub designation that you got in like bio fabrication types of jobs. And those are going to range from like really high paying jobs to kind of like moderate jobs where you have like people working in manufacturing. So you will need housing. And I'm seeing like the Advanced Regenerative Manufacturing Institute is getting involved with us, and like we're putting on some housing summits and like talking about this in relationship to like knowing that the region is going to get like 9,000 new jobs and you're going to need more housing.
I think the business partnerships are definitely an interesting topic that has come up quite a bit. We are seeing, I think there's sort of a renewed focus on the trades as well, about thinking about how do we better sort of partner through apprenticeship programs, and whether that's through community college, whether that's through labor organizations, whether that's through sort of on the job training, um, thinking about like how do we have the labor force that can build the homes, because that's incredibly important and is something that is, like so many of our industries, but it's certainly aging and is often sort of like one or two person shops, and the main person is, in their 60s, and like how does that get passed down, and that knowledge and that sort of employee base get built back up, because one, these are really good paying jobs and they're high demand. And so we're in a situation where both from the sort of 2008 housing crisis pushed a lot of folks out of the construction industry, and just sort of the general narrative that, the only way to get a good paying job was to go to college. It sort of pushed the whole, feels like, generation out of the trades, and we have to do more to build that back. And so there's certainly a partnership that we're seeing between the public-private sector areas. Anyway, there's also some interesting like construction type developments. I think that we're probably a little ways off for sort of like mass deployment of some of these, but whether that's modular housing factories, whether that's 3D printed homes. There's now a 3D printed home in Manchester, that a Rochester-based company built or printed, I guess. And so like we are starting to see this. Obviously, that's sort of a long ways, I think, off before you're seeing it again like widely deployed. But this is some of that like partnership, public-private. How do you start to innovate and solve this and do things in ways that tackle some of those other buckets that aren't, just the zoning and planning bucket?
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to ask someone whose specialty is, like you said, Sarah, like working in the food industry. It's like, oh, so like, okay, now go build a home for your folks. Like it shouldn't all fall on the business owner, but it's such a hot topic right now. Shifting gears a little bit, have there been any changes in recent legislation that could help improve the current housing crisis, or on the opposite end, that could potentially be a barrier to helping improve this housing crisis? You always have to talk about both sides.
Right, exactly. So yes, there was last legislative session was very productive when it came to the regulatory piece. We passed and the governor signed bills to allow, as we've talked about, ADUs. So the previous law was you had to allow for attached ADUs in New Hampshire and attached to single family homes, but you didn't have to allow detached, and you could require sort of a public hearing process. And that, about half the communities allowed detached, about half didn't. I forget exactly what number. I think it was like 60% or so had some form of a public hearing on at least one of them. And so you're in these situations where, okay, we almost always approve them, but you still need the public hearing just so we can like double check. And like that in and of itself is a problem, because it can cost thousands of dollars to get the designs ready to present. And if you even have a chance of being denied, that's a huge risk for a lot of people, right? And banks don't really want to lend on that. And it may just be something that people don't want to go through. And so you're putting up a barrier that is totally unnecessary. And so the state law expanded that to say you had to allow attached and detached by right. So if you meet the height setback standards, all you need is a building permit, and then you can go build your ADU. And so that was a big one. And so passed this House Bill 631, which was this Homes Near Jobs bill, which is what we were calling it, which allowed for multifamily in commercially zoned areas, specifically looking at retail and office space. So thinking about, office space conversion, or like those aging strip malls, where can you put multifamily housing where there's already infrastructure? Those were great places for that. And whether that's mixed use, so it's right above or, behind, whatever it is, there's some flexibility there. And all of that will still need to be implemented locally. The towns and cities decide the density, they decide the height, they decide the setbacks. All it's saying is that from a statewide perspective, we want to see multifamily development where there's already development and where we have these sort of commercial corridors. We don't want to see that like just single story strip mall stretch that we've all driven through in many towns. We want to open that area up for some multifamily development. There was also a bill to sort of rein in some excessive parking reforms. And so the bill said that you can't require more than one parking space per unit. The developer could absolutely and will, in the vast majority of cases, build more parking than that. But we shouldn't be in these situations where you're requiring 3 or 4 spots for a single home because that's creating, one, it's making it more expensive. Two, it's creating these just like seas of asphalt that no one wants and is totally unnecessary. And those costs get passed back down to people because that's how developers make money. Their buildings have to make money. And so if they're being forced to build extra parking that is costing tens of thousands of dollars, that's going to be pushed back down into rents. And so that's going to be higher costs for people. And so those were a couple of the bigger regulatory ones. We did on the, and I should also say in the state budget, the state required that state permits through the Department of Transportation and the Department of Environmental Services can be no longer than 60 days from sort of the start to finish process. And that's a huge improvement from, it would sometimes be over a year when you're waiting for a Department of Transportation permit to, maybe that's like create a new driveway onto a state road. You would need to get that permit for that. And they were so sort of backed up and didn't have a timeline in place to get things approved quicker. And that's just, delaying how quickly we can get a home onto the market. And again, that's a cost thing because you're holding on to all the construction costs. You're still paying for the land. You're paying for whatever you've gotten built so far. And that gets passed back down onto the rent. So a couple of big sort of regulatory pieces. On the sort of deeply affordable side, we did see the state budget go backwards on some of the investments, specifically to the Affordable Housing Fund, which is run through New Hampshire Housing. It's a low interest loan and grant program that helps finance affordable housing, so below market rate housing, oftentimes sort of deeply affordable housing for folks who are, maybe making $20,000-$30,000 a year, right? The market just can't provide those units, and those need to have some sort of financial subsidy to help make them work. In the last budget, we'd put $35 million to the Affordable Housing Fund. In this budget, we only put $10 million. And, there were less overall revenues and hard choices were made, but, we were a little disappointed that those hard choices came at the expense of affordable housing funding.
One of the things I might add is, and more bad news on the budget side was that I care very deeply about investing in good local planning. And it's always been kind of like a running joke that like our regional planning commissions in New Hampshire, there are 9 of them, get like $11,000 each from the state, which is just a really small amount of money to do the very important work that they do. And that was zeroed out. So now we don't give any state funding to our regional planning commissions, while at the same time still expecting them to support our communities to adapt to these changes in state law. And so like Nick mentioned earlier, so many of our communities either don't have planning staff, or they might have someone who is like a part-time sort of consultant working 1 day a week there. They might have like a part-time person who's like a land use secretary or admin kind of situation. They might be relying on a circuit rider from their regional planning commission, or they might have someone who is full-time but is wearing 6 different hats, like that poor guy in the Southwest who's the building code enforcement person and the building inspector and their planner who's serving both the planning board and the zoning board. And so supporting our regional planning commissions so that they can support our municipalities to address barriers in their zoning is super important. So that was disappointing.
And now, sort of taking that and making it a positive, how can the local business community, how can individuals be engaged in advocacy or get involved in some way to try and help? Obviously, it's not a one-person show and not one person will be able to fix the housing crisis in New Hampshire, but how can individuals and businesses get involved and try and help?
I have 2. So one is to get involved with your local planning board and other elected leaders. Make sure that they know your housing needs and how the housing crisis is impacting your business or you personally. I think that the voices of like community members is incredible, right? Especially if you're saying like, I am in support of this project, or I am in support of this zoning change. Because I think our planning boards don't hear a lot of that. People tend to show up at planning boards because they don't want something, not because they do want something. But I think specifically hearing from the business community is really important for our elected officials and our planning boards to be like, oh, this is impacting economic development in our community, which is a different kind of story. The other thing I'll add, and this is kind of a different one, is like support your employees volunteering. So if you're an organization that has employees who are interested in this, or like you as a business are facing this, and like encouraging and supporting your employees to attend planning board meetings or join their planning board, join their zoning board, be an elected official in their community, even if that's as simple as like I served on a planning board, and our planning board meetings would go until like 11 p.m. most nights, sometimes later. And the next day, I went into work a little bit late, and like my employer was fine with that. I was my own boss at the time. I was fine with that. And maybe with that too, including supporting board training. So whether they're somebody who is serving on like a nonprofit board that is a housing related organization, supporting like nonprofit board training so that not only are they serving on a board, but they're like a great board member and giving them time during their day to like prep for their meetings. But maybe same for if they want to join a local land use board. And so supporting opportunities for them to train, if it's like attending trainings or webinars with the Office of Planning and Development, for example. So in, talking to your planning boards, making sure they know your story and encouraging your employees to volunteer in this capacity too, and making sure that they have the training and the capacity that they need.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything Sarah just said there about getting involved, especially locally. There's so many different ways people can get involved and it truly, like, everyone can't do everything, but like everyone can do something. And so figuring out like what within your story or your time or your life you can be able to help is huge. And so like Sarah said, some of those bigger ones that can have a huge impact if you're running for office or seeking one of the appointed positions, if you're in a city or a place that does appointed land use board positions, those are huge. Being actually at the table voting on the decisions is the gold star. It's like the best of it because you're actually able to cast the vote that matters. But short of that, sharing your story with folks who are seeking those offices. We're coming right up next Tuesday on municipal elections in cities. 2026 we'll have the whole state legislature will be up again, and so making sure that if you're having conversation with folks who are seeking these offices, you're raising housing as an issue and either thanking them for a vote that they took on some of the bills we mentioned or asking them to support things in the future is hugely important. We also at Housing Action run a weekly, especially weekly during the legislative session. We try to do weekly outside the session too, but weekly newsletter where we highlight the bills that are coming up next week and sort of a quick, like, what can you do if you only have 5 minutes? And oftentimes that might be just sign in and support or email your legislator, like looking out for those little things that are not as big of a time commitment are also add up, right? And so every little bit helps build the narrative and helps build the support that helps policymakers really see that the majority of people are behind all this stuff. They want more action and they're here, but they absolutely do need to hear it.
And if you don't want to do any of that, but you have money and you could make a donation, support an organization like NeighborWorks Southern New Hampshire or give some money to Nick, Housing Action New Hampshire, and like become a member of that coalition. So Nick can't say that, but I can.
Thanks for the plug. and I know, and I should add the other piece is like there are a lot of folks who are like have technical, like you're interested in this topic and maybe you do this professionally. Like send over ideas. Like if you have a policy barrier that you want fixed because it's a huge headache for you and it's creating higher costs, like send it over to us. Like that's how we get most of our ideas and legislators get their ideas is hearing from people on the ground who are running into problems. And then there's other way, Plan New Hampshire and some of the regional housing coalitions do charrettes where you can volunteer your experience to work, on sort of affordable housing visioning sessions. So again, it's this idea of like, okay, well, what do you have time for? What do you have a a background in what are you interested in, and then try to figure out how does that plug in. And there's a lot of folks, including us and others, who are happy to help point you in the right direction.
And I'd be remiss to mention, the Greater National Chamber of Commerce, we do have an advocacy committee. We don't just focus on housing, we focus on multiple bills of each year that, affect the business community. But as you guys mentioned, housing, childcare, they're kind of the top two topics of conversation around the workforce right now. So almost all of the bills that our advocacy committee focused on this year were housing and childcare related. There were other ones too, but those were the top two areas of concentration. So if you don't know where to start for advocacy or for getting out there, go to an organization, go to, Housing Action, New Hampshire Housing, come to the chamber, talk to us. If you want your voice to be heard, but don't know where to go to someone else and ask for help in that. But the advocacy committee at the chamber, they meet every Monday morning at 8 a.m. via Zoom from January to June. And then they don't meet, during the off season when it's July through December. They might meet occasionally November, December, or something comes up. But if that's something you're interested in, Wendy is the chamber and the chamber staff member that runs that committee, our president and CEO. So reach out to Wendy if you want to join that. But with that being said, does anyone have any questions for the panelists? If you do, drop them in the Q&A real quick. Sarah, Nick, do you guys want to plug how your organizations again, how people can reach out, websites, phone numbers, things like that?
Yeah. So I should probably just, I guess, maybe I'll filibuster, Sarah, while you're typing things into the chat is probably the smarter way than to make you all remember this. But so our website is housingactionnh.org. You can go on there, and we have, we try to post, you can sign up for our newsletter on there. We try to post everything back up on the website too, and including some other like blog posts where we have sort of deeper dives on some of the specific issues. And again, if there's a question, we're always happy to try and pull resources for you. My email is nick@housingactionnh.org. And I'll drop that in the chat too. And so always happy to answer any questions.
It sounds like we have tech power, but yes, same. So you can easily find us by searching for New Hampshire Housing or nhhousing.org. My email is swrightsman@nhhfa.org. I think my phone number is on our website or our info@nhhfa.org. Email address is there too. If you reach out to that, you will eventually find me. I'll just point to like on our website, we have a whole bunch of like publications and reports, including one if you are interested in talking more about like how you as a business can get involved. We actually have one called Developing Employer Assisted Housing, and it's a guidebook for employers who are interested in getting more involved in housing, either development, doing things like master leases, or providing like subsidies to your employees. It has a bunch of case studies in it. That was done by an intern that we had a couple of years ago now, but we have a whole bunch of other great resources on our website too. And you can always reach out to me. We have a guide called How Do You Talk About Housing? How Do We Talk About Housing? And it was written by my boss and I, who are both sort of doing this like community engagement work. If you wanted to start a local conversation, that's something we'd be happy to support you with, or even having like a conversation with your employees in your workplace. That's something we'd be really happy to like help guide the sort of engagement and facilitation process of what that looks like.
Awesome. Well, you guys were so awesome, so thorough. We don't have any questions. Thank you so much, Nick and Sarah, for joining us today and chatting about this super important matter. Thank you to all the attendees for starting your morning with us and joining us. I will send a follow-up email if Nick and Sarah, you are both okay with it. I'll send an email to all the attendees with your emails in it and the website links, so that way they can reach out. So attendees, you'll get that in your inbox today. But thank you all so much for being here and supporting, supporting New Hampshire by getting educated on housing, and also for supporting the chamber. And I hope you guys all have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks
Thanks, everyone.
all.
Thanks,
Thanks, Emma.
Emma.
Thanks, Nick.
Bye.